He slammed the document down on the table so hard that little Nellie flinched and knocked her milk clean off the edge. Nobody moved to catch it. Victor Sedgwick, broad-shouldered, brass watch chain swinging, pointed one thick finger at Silas Rourke and said, "Loud enough for the whole feed store to hear. That creek runs through my land now. You water one cow from it, I'll have the sheriff out by morning." Silas said nothing. His jaw worked like he was chewing something he couldn't swallow. And Eliza Renford, the housekeeper, nobody in Bracken Hollow trusted. The quiet woman with the battered carpetbag and the careful eyes stood in the corner, holding a bolt of winter cloth, watching the most powerful man in the county try to destroy the only family she had stumbled into by accident. She already knew something about those documents that Sedgwick didn't know she knew, and she hadn't decided yet whether to say it. If you've ever been the stranger that nobody believed in, if you've ever held something important inside you while the room wrote you off, stay with me. This story is going to go somewhere you don't expect. Before we go any further, if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, please take 1 second and subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from, because I want to see how far this story travels. I read every single one. Now let's go back to Kansas. 1887, and a woman named Eliza who was about to make a decision that would change everything. She had not planned to stay. That was the first thing Eliza told herself when the stagecoach pulled away from Bracken Hollow's single main road and left her standing in a cold that felt personal, the kind of cold that finds the gaps in your coat and settles there like it owns the place. November in Kansas was not shy about what it intended. Sky was the color of old pewter. The wind came from the north and didn't apologize. She had a name written on a folded slip of paper, Silas Rourke, a farm 2.5 miles east of the settlement, and a job she'd answered by post $8 a month, room and board, housekeeper to a widowed man and his child. She had not asked for details beyond that. Details had not been kind to her lately. The man who met her with a wagon at the edge of town was not what she'd imagined, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had imagined. Silas Rourke was somewhere in his mid-30s, tall enough to make the wagon seat look undersized, kind of stillness in his face that either meant he was calm or he had learned a very long time ago to keep everything below the surface, where no one could reach it. His hands on the reins were rough. Not just from work, from the particular roughness that comes when a man stops taking care of himself because he can't find a reason to. He said, "Miss Renford." Not a question. A confirmation, like he was checking a list. She said, "Mr. Rourke." He waited until she climbed up without help. She didn't ask for it, and he didn't offer. And then he turned the horses east without another word. For most of the ride, she watched the empty land and tried not to feel anything about it. She had been in worse situations. She reminded herself of that precisely twice before she stopped believing it. Then the farmhouse appeared, and with it, a small figure standing on the porch. 4 years old, dark hair escaping from 2 uneven braids. A rag doll clutched against her chest like it was the only fixed point in a spinning world. The girl watched the wagon approach with eyes that were too old for her face, not in a sad way. Exactly. But in the way of a child who has learned that things you love can disappear without warning and has been quietly taking inventory ever since. Eliza didn't wave. She sensed without knowing why that this was not a child you waved at. When the wagon stopped and Silas climbed down, the little girl didn't run to him. She simply came off the porch at a careful pace and stood at the bottom of the steps, watching Eliza with a directness that would have been unsettling in an adult. "Nellie," Silas said, "this is Miss Renford. She's going to be keeping the house for us." Nellie looked at Eliza for a long moment. Then she held up the rag doll. "This is Mabel," she said. Eliza crouched down until she was at eye level with the girl her knees protested. The stagecoach had been a 14-hour ride, and she studied the doll with the seriousness it deserved. "Mabel's had a long day," she said. "She looks like she could use somewhere warm to sit." Something shifted in Nellie's expression. Not quite a smile. More like the first millimeter of a door that had been bolted shut. That was the beginning. The house was functional the way a tool is functional. Everything present that needed to be present. Nothing extra. Nothing that wasn't load-bearing. Kitchen that had been managed by necessity rather than attention. A parlor that still had a woman's chair near the window, angled just so that no one had moved. Eliza noticed the chair and did not comment on it. She cooked the first supper from what she found in the larder, which was a limited performance, and served it on plates she had to wash before she could use them. Nellie appeared at the table carrying Mabel. Without thinking too hard about it, Eliza pulled out the chairs beside Nellie and set a small folded cloth on it, like a place setting. She put a tiny portion on a saucer and set it in front of the empty chair. Nellie stared at her. Silas, standing in the doorway with his coat still on, watched what Eliza was doing with an expression she couldn't read. "Mabel eats small," Eliza said, as if this were a reasonable logistical observation. "She'll need to work up to bigger portions." Nellie sat down very carefully, like she was afraid the moment might break if she moved too quickly. She arranged Mabel's cloth napkin. She folded her own hands. And then quietly she ate her supper. Silas hung up his coat and sat down. The three of them ate without much talking, and the doll's saucer sat where it was, and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and for the first time in Eliza's memory, the silence around a table didn't feel like something was missing. It just felt like something was waiting. She did not sleep well the first night. The wind off the prairie found the window gaps, and the unfamiliar sounds of the house kept pulling her up toward the surface before she could settle into actual rest. She lay in the narrow room off the kitchen, her room now, she supposed, and listened to the farm breathe around her and thought, as she always did when things got too quiet, Colorado. She pushed the thought back down. In the morning, she found Nellie already. At the kitchen table, Mabel propped beside her, both of them watching the door like they'd been waiting. "Mabel says she's hungry," Nellie said. "Then we'd better not keep her waiting," Eliza said, and started the stove. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were the kind of not easy that Eliza knew how to handle: physical, practical, solvable. Pantry mice were handled with 3 traps and some strategic patience. The root cellar needed reorganizing, which she did methodically over 2 days, while Nellie sat on an overturned crate and told Mabel what each vegetable was called. The kitchen curtains were past saving, and she remade them from a worn wool blanket she found in the cedar chest, which at least stopped the draft. The woodpile was stacked wrong. She didn't say that to Silas. She simply restacked it on a day he was in the east field, and it burned better and longer after that. Silas noticed. He didn't say anything about the curtains or the woodpile or the cellar. But she caught him studying the changes the way a man studies something he doesn't quite know how to account for, not suspicious, exactly, but recalibrating. On the 9th day, he said, "At breakfast, you've done work here." Not a compliment in any conventional sense, more like a man stating a geological fact. "It's what you're paying me for," she said. He looked at his coffee. "3 women before you didn't last 2 weeks, I heard." "Nellie's not," he stopped. Started again. "She's not an easy child right now. She's a child who lost her mother," Eliza said. "That's not a behavior problem. That's a wound." Silas set his cup down with a careful precision that she was starting to recognize as his version of a strong reaction. He pushed back from the table, picked up his hat, and went out without another word. She hadn't been wrong, though. She knew that. And she thought, though she was not certain, that he knew it too. The town came to her attention slowly, the way cold seeps in. She first felt it at the feed store when she went in to pick up a supply order Silas had placed. The conversation that stopped. The 2 women near the bolts of calico who watched her the way you watch something you've already formed an opinion about. The feed store owner, a Mr. Garland, stout and careful, who was perfectly polite and somehow managed to make politeness feel like distance. She got the order. She drove back to the farm. She didn't mention it to Silas. A week later, it was more direct. A woman named Mrs. Haverstock, whose husband owned the lumber business, whose opinion apparently carried the weight of local law, stopped Eliza on the road after services and said, in the bright, specific way of people who think they're being kind, "We're all just hoping Mr. Rourke isn't being taken advantage of, given his situation." Eliza looked at her. "He's not," she said. "Of course, Mrs." Haverstock said. "Of course. Just a woman without family, without connections here, looking for a position with a widowed landowner." She let the sentence finish itself. Eliza thought about at least 3 responses, chose none of them. Said, "Good afternoon, Mrs." Haverstock, with a pleasantness she did not feel, and walked to where the wagon was tied. She was shaking slightly when she climbed up. Not from cold. She told herself it didn't matter. She had been underestimated before. She knew what that felt like, and she knew how to carry it without letting it change her posture. But it mattered more than she wanted it to, because this place was starting to feel like something she hadn't expected it to feel like. And that made what people thought about her here matter in ways it hadn't mattered in a long time. At home, she caught herself thinking the word and didn't correct it. Nellie had saved her a biscuit from supper, wrapped in a cloth and placed on the kitchen table, with Mabel sitting beside it as a kind of honor guard. Mabel guarded it, Nellie said seriously. Nobody touched it. Nobody would dare, Eliza said, and sat down and ate it, and it tasted like something she couldn't name. First real crack in the town's wall came from an unlikely direction. Old Mr. Pete, who ran the small post office and had been watching Bracken Hollow since before any of the current residents arrived, stopped Eliza one afternoon and said, with the directness of a man who no longer cared about the strategic navigation of social opinion, "You're the one who restacked the Rourke woodpile." She blinked. "I am Silas doesn't take help, mister," Pete said. He didn't say a word about it, which means it bothered him right down to the ground. That pile'll burn all winter. He looked at her for a long moment. "Just so you know, not everybody here is listening to Haverstock's wife." He went back inside before she could respond. She stood on the street, holding a letter she'd come to post, and for a reason she couldn't immediately explain, her eyes stung. She blinked it away. She had no time for that. But she thought about it for a long time on the drive home. It was in the third week of November that she first heard the name Sedgwick. Silas mentioned it the way you mention a bad tooth, not constantly, but with the awareness of something that was always there and was not getting better. Victor Sedgwick, land speculator, had filed a claim with the county that placed a parcel boundary through the middle of the creek, feeding the eastern pasture. If the claim was upheld, Silas would lose water rights to the land that kept his cattle alive through winter and kept the eastern fields viable come spring. "He's got an attorney," Silas said. He wasn't talking to her. Exactly. He was saying it the way men say things when they're trying to make them smaller by putting them in the air. "I've got Jonas Bell, and Jonas is good, but Sedgwick's got money behind him." "What do the original survey documents say?" Lisa asked. Silas looked at her the way people look when someone who wasn't supposed to ask a question asks it. "They say what they always said," he told her. "That's what I can't understand. Jonas says the parcel line Sedgwick's filing claims doesn't match what was recorded. But Sedgwick's attorney has a document that says different." Eliza poured more coffee into his cup. She was thinking, "Where was the survey filed?" she asked. "County recorder," he said. "Why?" "Just wondering," she said. She wasn't just wondering. She had spent 4 years in a Colorado land office before the man who ran it had decided her work was useful enough to take, and her reputation was convenient enough to damage. She understood property records the way a carpenter understands wood grain, not because she had memorized rules, but because she had handled them until they became a kind of language she could read without effort. And something Silas had just said was pulling at the back of her mind like a thread caught on a nail. The next time Silas was in town on his own business, Eliza drove the wagon to the county seat on an errand she told no one about. She paid 20 cents to review the public survey records. She sat in the drafty recorder's office for 2 hours with the documents spread across a reading table, her finger moving across the lines of plat descriptions, and at the end of it she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. There it was, 17 feet. The original survey had a creek reference marker placed at a natural landmark, a particular river bend, that any surveyor in 1869 would have used as fixed. Document Sedgwick's attorney was presenting had shifted that reference marker by exactly 17 feet, not enough to seem obvious, but enough to move the parcel boundary across the water. It was subtle. It was precise. It was the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And it was wrong. She rewrapped her coat, thanked the records clerk, and drove home in the cold with the information sitting in her chest like a coal that hadn't decided yet whether to go out or ignite. She had not told Silas where she was going. She had not told him what she knew. She had not told him why she knew it. And, sitting in that wagon with the winter wind, off the Kansas's prairie pushing against her from every direction, she understood that the reason she was hesitating was not tactical. It was not because she was waiting for the right moment or calculating the best approach or thinking through the legal implications. She was hesitating because telling Casalis meant explaining how she knew. And explaining how she knew meant opening a door she had driven 14 hours on a stagecoach specifically to leave closed. The Colorado thing. She pulled the horses up at the edge of the farm lane and sat for a moment in the gray late afternoon, the farmhouse visible in the distance with its kitchen lamp already burning in the window, because Nellie had learned to light it when it started getting dark and was intensely proud of this responsibility. Eliza watched that small square of light for a long time. She thought about the woman she had been before Colorado. She thought about the man who had smiled while he took everything she'd built and repurposed it for himself, and left her with a reputation that required a 14-hour stagecoach ride and a new state to escape. She thought about what it cost to trust someone with the useful parts of yourself, how it required handing them at the same time a map to everything you were trying to protect. She thought about Nellie at the table, arranging Mabel's napkin with total seriousness. She thought about a small wooden chair pulled up to a kitchen table, because a child's grief deserved to be fed the same as anything else. She clicked her tongue at the horses and drove toward the lamp. She was not going to tell Silas yet, but she was going to do something with what she knew. Whether that was wise, whether the outcome would be a rescue or a second catastrophe, she genuinely did not know. She had been wrong about her own judgment before, and the evidence of that was somewhere behind her in Colorado, wearing her work and her name. But the lamp was in the window, and Nellie had lit it, and the farmhouse was close enough now that she could smell wood smoke. And something in Eliza Renford that had been very carefully folded up and stored out of reach for the better part of 3 years was doing something inconvenient and unexpected, and, she suspected, probably irreversible. It was beginning, without her permission, to hope. The hope was the dangerous part. Eliza had lived long enough to know that hope was not a comfort, it was an exposure. You couldn't hope for something without first admitting you wanted it, and wanting things had a cost she was still paying installments on from 3 years back. So she did what she always did with dangerous things. She put it somewhere practical. She converted it into work. She got up earlier, stayed up later, made herself useful in ways that were measurable and contained, and didn't require anyone to look at her directly and see what was actually happening inside her chest. December came in hard. The first real snow hit on a Tuesday, which Eliza knew because she had started keeping a small calendar on the kitchen wall, partly for practical reasons, partly because Nellie had discovered it and now marked each passing day with a small penciled X and treated this as a solemn daily duty. The snow didn't announce itself. It was just there when Eliza woke before dawn to start the stove, pressing against the windows in the blue-dark silence, and she stood in the kitchen in her wool stockings, looking at it, and felt the familiar calculation of a woman who has lived through enough winters to know that weather is not something you have feelings about, it is something you prepare for. She had already moved the extra wood inside 2 days ago. She had already checked the weather stripping on the back door, which had been inadequate, and stuffed the gap with a length of old rope until Silas could address it properly. She had already made sure there was enough dried food in the cellar to last 3 weeks if the roads became impassable. Silas came in from the morning chores stamping snow off his boots and found her standing at the stove with coffee already made, and he stopped it in the doorway for a second. In that way, he sometimes had he kept being surprised to find us in working order, like some part of him was still waiting for things to fall apart. "Roads will be bad today," he said. "I know," she said. "I moved the extra blankets to the chest in the hall last night. Nellie's room keeps cold." He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down and picked up his coffee cup. Nellie came down shortly after, still in her nightgown, Mabel under one arm, hair completely destroyed by sleep. She walked directly to the window, pressed her nose against the glass, and said snow. "Good morning to you too," Eliza said. "Mabel wants to go outside. Mabel will need boots then." Nellie looked down at the doll's cloth feet with the gravity of a woman reconsidering a travel itinerary. "She doesn't have boots. Then Mabel will have to watch from the window while you go out, and you can tell her everything you see." This solution was acceptable. Nellie went upstairs to dress, which was a process that took considerably longer than it should have, and involved several loud consultations with Mabel about which wolfskins were appropriate, And Eliza turned back to the stove and felt something she did not examine too carefully, something warm and ordinary and quietly devastating in the way that ordinary things become when you have been without them long enough. Silas was still at the table. He hadn't left for the barn yet, which was unusual. She could feel him thinking. He had a particular quality to his silence when he was working something out heavier than his regular silence, which was already considerable. She had learned by now not to fill it. He'd get there or he wouldn't. The Sedgwick hearing, he said finally. Jonas Bell thinks it'll be set for sometime in January. She kept her eyes on the stove. That's soon. Sedgwick's pushing for it. A pause. He wants it done before spring planting. He knows if I lose the water rights, I can't plant the east field. And if I can't plant the east field, I'm running a farm half the size it needs to be. He stopped. Anyway, she agreed. He was quiet again. Then you asked about the survey documents a few weeks back. She turned around then because she couldn't not. I did. Why? She held his gaze for a measured moment. Was curious. Silas Rursick was not a man who was easily redirected, and the look he gave her now was the look of a man who knew he was being redirected and was deciding whether to push through it or let it go. He was not stupid. He had probably never been stupid a day in his life, even on the days he'd acted like it, and she got the impression there had been a few of those in the cavalry years, before the farm and the wife and Nellie and all the losses that came after. He let it go. But she could see him filing it away somewhere, the way he filed everything quietly, methodically, in that interior space, where he kept the things he wasn't done thinking about. Jonas says Sedgwick's attorney is named Clifford Marsh, Silas said. He's from Topeka. He's handled 6 land disputes in the last 2 years. Won 4 of them. What happened in the 2 he lost? Silas picked up his cup again. Jonas didn't say. She turned back to the stove. She was thinking about 17 feet. She was thinking a survey marker and a river bend and a piece of paper in a county recorder's office that told a different story than the one Victor Sedgwick wanted told. She was also thinking about what it would cost her to tell the truth about how she knew what she knew. The cost was not abstract. It had a shape and a weight and a particular texture she recognized from experience. It felt like handing someone a key and not being able to take it back once they'd used it, even if they used it well. She was not ready. But she was running out of time, and she knew it, and the knowing sat in her like a splinter, nothing that would kill you, nothing you could stop feeling. The snow kept coming for 3 days. In those 3 days, Eliza learned things about Silas Rourke that she hadn't been able to learn in the 4 weeks before, not because the storm made him talkative, but because the enforced proximity of a small house in a blizzard stripped away the normal architecture of distance that people maintain between themselves. You cannot be far away from someone when you are both in the same kitchen for 17 consecutive hours. She learned that he read. Not the newspaper, though he read that too, but actual books. There was a small shelf in the parlor she hadn't looked at closely, and she discovered him there one evening with something old and worn. Most of its windows were dark, and when she looked at the spine, it was a book of philosophy that looked like it had been read through several times. He didn't explain it, and she didn't ask. She learned that he had a temper he was very, very careful about. She didn't see it directly, but she saw the effort to contain it. Once, when the barn door latch broke on the 2nd day and he came in, having spent an hour in the cold fighting it, she watched him stand in the kitchen with his hands at his sides for a full 30 seconds before he said anything. Whatever was inside him during those 30 seconds was not small, but he waited it out, and then he said, "I need a new latch mechanism. I'll go to town when the road clears," and that was the end of it. She found that she respected the 30 seconds more than if he'd simply been calm. She learned he watched Nella watch something precious that has been damaged with a carefulness that was also a kind of grief. He never babied her, never spoke to her in the softened tones people use with fragile things. But there was something in how he tracked her around a room, some background vigilance that said more about what he was afraid of losing than anything he would ever say directly. And on the 2nd night of the storm, when Nellie fell asleep on the parlor rug, with Mabel on her chest and the fire burning low, and Silas carried her upstairs with the absolute gentleness of a man who would have called himself not gentle, Eliza sat alone by the dying fire and understood that she was in serious trouble. Not the practical kind, the other kind. Mrs. Haverstock came to call on the first clear day after the storm, which Eliza suspected was not coincidental. She brought another woman with her, a Mrs. Delacour, younger, who had the look of someone who had been told what to think and was doing her best to think it convincingly, and she appeared at the front door with a tin of butter cookies and a smile that didn't reach anything behind her eyes. "We just wanted to check on the Rourke household, Mrs. Saul said, given the storm." "We're quite well," Eliza said. She stepped back from the door because not letting them in would be worse than letting them in. "Come in out of the cold." She made tea. She did this with the particular focused courtesy of a woman who knows she is being watched for flaws and is not going to give anyone the satisfaction of finding one. The kitchen was clean. The stove was going. The bread she'd made that morning was on the counter, and the whole house smelled like it, which was either going to help her or be interpreted as calculated. Nellie appeared in the doorway from the hall, looked at the two visitors, and said, "Who are you?" "Nellie," Eliza said. "We're friends of your father's, Mrs. Haverstock said, with the bright precision of a woman who is very good at speaking to children, in ways that are actually meant for adults. "We've known him a long time." Since before she paused. For a long time. Nellie looked at Mabel. Then she looked at Mrs. Haverstock. "Mabel doesn't know you." "Well," said Mrs. Haverstock. "Nellie, why don't you take Mabel to the parlor?" Eliza said, "and I'll bring your milk in a moment." Nellie considered this. She looked at Eliza, then at the guests, then back at Eliza, with the evaluating expression of a 4-year-old who understood more about the temperature in a room than she was supposed to. Then she left, taking Mabel with her, and her small footsteps retreated down the hall with a distinct lack of hurry. Tea was poured. The cookies were arranged. Mrs. Haverstock took a sip and said, "You've certainly settled in." "I've been here 6 weeks," Eliza said. "Quite comfortable, Mrs. Delacour offered, looking around the kitchen with a brightness that was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite making it. "I work to make it comfortable," Eliza said. "It's a working household. That's the job, of course." Mrs. Haverstock set down her cup with a small, precise click. "We just as women who care about this community, we feel a responsibility to make sure that Mr. Rourke has the support he needs. Proper support. From people who understand the situation. His wife was deeply loved here. Margaret was—" She stopped, and for a moment something genuine moved across her face, something that wasn't about Eliza at all. "She was a wonderful woman." "I have no doubt," Eliza said. "And Silas has had a very hard time of it." "I imagine he has. We'd hate to see that made more complicated." She looked at Eliza directly now. "You understand." Eliza wrapped both hands around her teacup. She took a slow breath through her nose. She thought about 17 feet and a forged survey marker and a man in Colorado who had smiled while he took everything she had. And she thought about Nellie asleep on the rug with Mabel on her chest. And she thought about 30 seconds of a man holding his temper while his hands stayed at his sides. "Mrs. Haverstock," she said, "I am a housekeeper. I cook. I clean. I manage the larder and the repairs as in the child. I am paid $8 a month. I have not asked for anything beyond that, and I have not taken anything beyond that." She set down her own cup. "I understand that this town has an idea about who I am and what I want. Can't change an idea. All I can do is what I'm doing. And what I'm doing is keeping this house." The silence that followed was not comfortable. Mrs. Haverstock searched her face for something guilt, or calculation, or the particular kind of desperation that would confirm the story she'd already written, and didn't find it. That seemed to unsettle her more than anything else would have. They left shortly after, taking the tin of cookies with them, which Eliza thought was either an accident or a statement, and suspected was a statement. Silas came in from the barn to find her at the kitchen table, with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on the window. "Mrs. Haverstock was here," she said. He took off his hat. "I saw the buggy on the road. She's worried about your welfare." He made a sound that was not a laugh and not a laugh. "Silas." She turned to look at him. "I want to be straightforward with you about something." He waited. "People in this town are going to talk about me until they find a reason to stop or until I leave. I can't control which one of those happens or when. What I can tell you is that everything I have done in this house since I arrived has been exactly what it appears to be." She held his eyes. "I want you to know that, whatever else happens, whatever you hear." He looked at her for a long, serious moment. Then he said, "I know that, Eliza." Most of its windows were dark. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She turned back to the window before her expression could do anything she didn't want it to do. 2 weeks before the county hearing, Victor Sedgwick came to the farm. He didn't send word ahead. He arrived on a clear, cold morning in a good carriage behind 2 horses that cost more than most farmers in Bracken Hollow saw in a year. And he came to the front door, not the side door, the front, and knocked like a man who expected doors to open quickly for him. Eliza opened it. He was exactly what she'd expected from hearing his name. Large in the way of men who have been told their size is an advantage not fat, but substantial, with the particular confidence of someone who had never needed to be quiet in a room, because rooms had always organized themselves around him. He wore a good coat. His boots were expensive and clean in a way that suggested he had someone to clean them. He looked at her with the specific blankness of a man who has encountered a door when he expected an entrance. "I'm here to see Rourke," he said. "Mr. Rourke is in the East Field," she said. "I can take a message." His eyes moved around her into the house, an inventory she recognized as performative, establishing that he could look if he wanted to, that her position in the doorway was some suggestion he was tolerating rather than a boundary he was respecting. "Tell him Victor Sedgwick came by," he said. "Tell him I wanted to offer him the opportunity to resolve this matter before the county makes it a spectacle. I'm a fair man. I'm willing to talk terms." "I'll tell him," she said. He looked at her, then really looked at her, the first time since he'd arrived. She kept her face perfectly still. She had considerable practice at this. "You're the housekeeper," he said. "I am." Something moved in his eyes, not interest exactly, but a recalibration. The kind a man makes when he realizes the obstacle in front of him is paying more attention than he'd assumed. "What's your name?" he asked. "Renford," she said. "Eliza Renford." He repeated it, half to himself, testing the weight of it for reasons she couldn't read. Then he nodded, turned, went back to his carriage, and drove away without looking back. She stood in the doorway, watching until the carriage was out of sight. Then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and thought very hard for a very long time. Sedgwick knew something, or he suspected something. The way he'd looked at her at the end, that recalibration meant he was adding her to his accounting of the situation, and that was not good. A man like Sedgwick didn't underestimate obstacles that had already drawn his attention. He simply found different ways around them. She had not told Silas about the survey records yet. She had told herself she was waiting for the right moment, and that was partly true. But the rest of the truth, the part she'd been not examining, was that she had been hoping she might find a way to handle it without having to explain herself. Without having to open the Colorado door. She understood now that there was no version of this where that door stayed shut. When Silas came in for the midday meal, she told him about Sedgwick's visit, word for word. He listened without interrupting, which was typical of him. And when she finished, he sat very still for a moment. "Terms," he said. That's what he said. His terms. Silas's jaw was doing the thing she'd noticed before. "He rides out here to offer me terms on property that's already mine." "He's positioning," she said. "He wants you to feel like the situation has already been decided, and negotiation is the best you can hope for." Silas looked at her. "He does this," she said. "Men like him. They establish the premise before the argument even starts. If you're discussing terms, you've already conceded the underlying question." The silence that followed had a different quality than usual. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at the woodpile, that same careful recalibration, except this time it was aimed at her. "Eliza," he said slowly, "what do you know about this?" She had rehearsed several versions of this moment over the past weeks. None of them had felt right because none of them were fully honest, and she had reached the point where the honesty was costing her more than the honesty would. She took a breath. "I went to the county recorder's office," she said, "about 3 weeks ago, when you were in town for the Garland order. Still. I reviewed the survey documents," she said, "the original filing from 1869, and the amended record that Sedgwick's attorney submitted." She kept her voice level, factual, like she was reading from the document itself. "The boundary marker in the original survey is referenced to a river bend, a natural landmark. In Sedgwick's amended document, the same marker is placed 17 feet east of where the original puts it. That 17 feet is what moves the parcel line across your creek." Quiet was absolute. Even the wind outside seemed to hold. "It's subtle," she said. You'd have to know how these filings work to catch it. The language is nearly identical. It's not a forgery in the obvious sense. It's an alteration. Very careful, very specific. Silas said, "How do you know how these filings work?" And there it was. She had known this was coming. She had known it since the recorder's office, since the wagon on the farm lane, since the lamp in the window on that first evening. She had known, and she had been backing toward it, and she had run out of room. Before I came to Kansas, she said, I worked in a land office in Colorado. For 4 years. He waited. I was good at it, she said, and something in saying that out loud, something in the plain declarative fact of it was harder than she'd expected. I understood the records, how surveys were filed, how boundaries were established, how documents could be challenged or defended. I had a detailed knowledge of how the system worked. Why didn't you tell me this? She started again, because of why I left. Another kind of quiet. There was a man, she said, the man who ran the office. He used my work, he had been using it for years, letting me do the complex analysis while he took the credit, which I accepted because I needed the position and I was good at the work, and I told myself it was enough. She folded her hands on the table. Then there was a dispute, a large one. A cattle company against a homestead family. Cattle company was wrong. I found the evidence. I prepared the case. Her voice stayed even. He submitted it under his name. He won. He received the recognition and the payment. And when I objected, she stopped again. He told people I had fabricated the records to favor the homestead. He had enough standing in the county that people believed him. My reputation in that office, in that town, was done inside a week. She looked at her hands. So I left, she said, and I came somewhere no one knew who I was. And I did not tell you about any of it, because I was not ready to hear whether you would believe me or believe a version of me that someone else had decided was true. The fire ticked. Outside a crow called once and went silent. Silas said, "Do you have proof?" Of the 17 feet. Can Jonas Bell use it? She blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say. Yes, she said. I made notes. I can reconstruct the comparison from memory, and Jonas can verify it against the original document. Then we need to go see Jonas Bell, Silas said. He pushed back from the table and stood up. Today, if the road stared at him. Silas. The man in Colorado was a thief, he said, with a flatness that left no room for argument, as if he were stating the boiling point of water. That's got nothing to do with what you know or what you're worth. I'm not interested in revisiting it. She opened her mouth. Unless, he said, you want to talk about it. Do you want to talk about it? Not particularly, she said after a moment. Then we're going to see Jonas, he said, and reached for his coat. She sat at the table for 3 full seconds after he went to get the horses, 3 seconds of something she couldn't name and wouldn't try to, and then she got up and put on her own coat and called to Nellie that they were going to town, and Mabel would need her traveling shawl, and went out into the cold Kansas afternoon feeling, for the first time in longer than she could account for, like she was walking toward something instead of away from it. Jonas Bell was a compact man of about 50, with ink-stained fingers and the particular focus of someone who had spent decades turning complicated problems into simple language. He had a small office above the dry goods store that smelled like paper and old coffee, and he listened to everything Elias said, without interrupting, with his hands folded on the desk and his eyes moving between her and Silas. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Miss Renford, if you're correct about the 17 feet, and I want to verify it myself against the original, which I should have already pulled, then what Sedgwick's attorney has submitted is not an amended document. Fraudulent one. Yes, she said. That changes the nature of the hearing considerably. Yes, she said again. Jonas looked at Silas. Why didn't you bring this to me sooner? Silas looked at Eliza. Jonas followed the look. He absorbed it with the professionalism of a man who has learned to read rooms efficiently. I see, he said. He turned back to Eliza. Could you be available to support my review of the original survey? You wouldn't need to testify, but your analysis would guide my preparation. Yes, she said. Good. He made a note. He made several notes, with the focus speed of a man who had just found solid ground under a case he'd been worried about. Sedgwick's attorney is capable and experienced. But if the document is fraudulent, capable and experienced doesn't help you when the original survey disproves your claim in a courtroom. He looked up. We have a chance, he said, a real one. On the drive back, Nellie fell asleep against Eliza's side. Before they were a mile from town, Mabel clutched loosely in one arm. Eliza sat very still so as not to disturb her. The cold was sharp, and the road was rutted, and the horses blew steam into the early dark. Silas drove without speaking for a while. Then he said quietly, so as not to wake Nellie, "Thank you." "I should have told you sooner," she said, probably. A pause. "But you told me." She looked out at the dark prairie, at the shapes of things going colorless in the dusk. Nellie shifted against her and made a small unconscious sound and settled again, her weight warm and real through Eliza's coat. "Silas," she said, "Sedgwick saw me this morning. When he came to the house, he looked at me like—" She stopped, choosing the words. "He's going to find out I went to the recorder's office. These things get around in a county seat. Someone will mention it. And when he knows, he'll know what I know, and he'll know I know why." Silas's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "Let him know." "He'll come at me," she said. "He'll try to find out who I am and where I came from, and whether there's something there he can use." "Silence," Silas said, not accusing, just asking. She thought about the man in Colorado and the reputation that had been disassembled like a fence in a wind storm. She thought about whether any of that could be weaponized by a man like Sedgwick, and the answer was possibly. Men like Sedgwick were good at finding the broken places and pressing on them. "Possibly," she said honestly. Silas drove. "Then we'd better win before he has time to look," he said. The farmhouse lamp was visible in the distance. That same small steady light, and Nellie slept against Eliza's side with the absolute trust of a child who has decided, without asking anyone's permission, that you are safe. And Eliza looked at the light and felt the whole precarious weight of what she was holding, this life she had stumbled into and stayed for and was now, apparently, going to fight for whether she'd planned to or not. She had not planned to stay. She was staying. She didn't examine what that meant. Not tonight. Tonight the lamp was burning, and the road was cold, and Nellie was warm against her arm, and that was enough to work with. But in the morning there would be work to do, and a man who played rough, and a county hearing that was going to decide whether the light in that window belonged to a family or to Victor Sedgwick's land ledger. And Eliza Renford, who had once of its windows were dark, who had once been stripped of her reputation, and left to rebuild herself from scratch on an honest foundation, was not going to let that happen without making him feel every inch of those 17 feet. Jonas Bell worked fast once he had something to work with. Within 3 days of their meeting above the dry goods store, he had pulled the original 1,869 survey from the county archive himself, driven out to compare it against Eliza's reconstruction, and come back with the particular energy of a man who has been handed confirmation of what he already suspected. He spread both documents on his desk, the original, and Sedgwick's amended filing, and walked Eliza through the comparisons point by point, not because she needed the explanation, but because he needed to hear himself say it out loud, to see certain he wasn't seeing what he wanted to see. He wasn't. The 17 feet were there. Precisely, deliberately, and visibly, to anyone who hadn't handled enough survey documents to know where to look. "Marsh is good," Jonas said, meaning Sedgwick's attorney. He would have known this was risky, which means Sedgwick told him the risk was acceptable. He tapped the amended document with one ink-stained finger. That tells us something about how confident Sedgwick was that nobody would catch it. He didn't expect the farm to have anyone who could read a survey, Eliza said. Jonas looked at her over the tops of his spectacles. "No," he said. He did not. There was a particular satisfaction in that, and she didn't try to pretend there wasn't. The hearing was set for January 14th. They had 22 days. Jonas's strategy was clean. Present the original survey, establish the discrepancy in the boundary marker placement, and challenge the authenticities of Sedgwick's amended document on the grounds that it contradicted a public record that had been unchallenged for 18 years. He did not need to prove fraud in the legal sense. That was a higher bar and a different proceeding. He needed only to demonstrate that Sedgwick's claim rested on a document that could not be reconciled with the established record. If the judge accepts the original as controlling, Jonas told Silas, the claim fails on its own terms. Sedgwick's attorney doesn't get to argue the boundary because the boundary he's arguing doesn't exist. And if the judge doesn't accept it, Silas said, then we have a harder conversation. Jonas looked at his papers. But I think he will. Judge Alderman is methodical. He doesn't like arguments built on documents he can't verify. Marsh knows that, which is why Marsh made the alterations subtle enough to survive a casual review. Problem for Marsh is that my review was not casual. He glanced at Eliza when he said it. She said nothing. But Silas noticed. The 22 days were not quiet. Eliza had expected the farm work to continue, as Normal had counted on it. In fact, because physical work was how she kept her thinking organized when other things were pulling at her from too many directions. And the farm did not disappoint in that regard. December in Kansas had a relentless quality, a daily inventory of things that needed doing, the cattle, the feed, the ice that formed on the water trough and had to be broken each morning, the endless management of firewood and food, and the small specific needs of a 4-year-old who was currently convinced that Mabel had developed a cough and required medicinal attention. She doesn't have a cough, Eliza said, examining the rag doll with the seriousness the situation demanded. She coughed last night, Nellie said firmly. I heard her. Mabel sleeps soundly. I've observed her. Maybe she coughs in her sleep. Eliza pressed 2 fingers lightly to the doll's cloth chest as if checking a pulse. Her breathing is strong, she said, but we'll keep her warm today, just to be safe. Nellie looked slightly less certain of the cough after this. She tucked Mabel into a small blanket and set her near the stove, and the matter was resolved to everyone's satisfaction except possibly Mabel's. Silas had watched this from across the room. He was doing that more watching, in a way that was different from the careful tracking she'd noticed early on. That tracking had been the vigilance of a man monitoring for potential problems. This was something else. Something she wasn't going to name, because naming it would require her to do something about it, and she had enough on her hands with 22 days and Victor Sedgwick. The town was watching too, in its own way. Word had gotten out, as word always did in Bracken Hollow, with the speed and comprehensiveness of weather, that the Rourke farm had filed a challenge to Sedgwick's claim, and that the challenge was not the desperate face-saving gesture that most people had expected from an outgunned farmer with a country attorney, but something more substantive. The source of that substance was not public knowledge, but the county recorder's office had multiple employees, and small towns were not sealed environments. Most of its windows were dark, and by the second week of December there were murmurs that Silas Rourke's housekeeper had been seen in the records office reviewing survey documents. Eliza heard it first from old Mr. Pete, who mentioned it with the careful neutrality of a man giving a warning, dressed as information. People are curious, he said when she came to post a letter. About you. More than before. More than before wasn't much, she said. It's enough. He looked at her directly, which was not something he did lightly. She had learned that about him. Sedgwick's asking questions. She went still. About me specifically? About who you are and where you came from? He paused. I don't know what he's looking for, but a man like Sedgwick doesn't ask questions because he's curious. He asks them because he expects the answers to be useful. She thanked him. She drove home. She sat in the wagon at the edge of the farm lane for the 3rd time since she'd arrived, looking at the lamp in the kitchen window. Most of its windows were dark, and this time the feeling in her chest was not hope or anything warm. It was the cold, specific dread who knows a clock is running and cannot see the face of it. Sedgwick was looking into her past. If he found the Colorado story, and she had to assume he would find some version of it, because the man she'd worked for had made sure to leave a version of it that survived he would use it. The exact shape of how he'd use it she couldn't predict, but she understood the general architecture. If Eliza Renford's credibility could be destroyed, Jonas Bell's case could be undermined. If the survey's analysis could be attributed to a woman with a history of fabricating records, which was the version of her that existed in one Colorado county, documented and damaging, then the challenge to Sedgwick's claim became the work of an unreliable source. It was elegant in the way of things that are very bad. She told Silas that night. Not the fear she left the fear out, but the strategic picture. Sedgwick was looking for something to use against her. He would probably find the Colorado story. They needed to be prepared for it to come up at the hearing. Silas listened. He was at the table with a cup of cooling coffee, and he turned the cup in his hands while she talked, not looking at it, looking at her. If it comes up, she said, Jonas needs to know everything, the real version, not what went on record. He needs to know what actually happened, so he has the whole picture. When do you want to tell him? Silas said. I don't want to tell him, she said. But I will. He set the cup down. Do you want me there? He said. She looked at him for a moment. The question was simple. He meant it simply. He was not offering to fight her battle. She could see in his face that he understood it was hers. He was just offering to be in the room. Yes, she said. I think I do. They went to Jonas's office the next morning. Nellie stayed with old Mr. Pete, who had 3 cats and a checkers board, and whose company she had recently decided she approved of, largely because he addressed Mabel directly and without condescension. Jonas listened to the Colorado story the way he listened to everything, with total stillness, hands folded, eyes attentive. When Eliza finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The man's name? Arthur Hale," she said. "He ran the Garfield County Land Office in Colorado from 1,879s to at least 1,884. Possibly still does, I don't know. And the record that exists shows that I was dismissed for falsifying survey analysis in favor of a Homestead family. That's what Hale put into the administrative record." She kept her voice flat. "The Homestead family won the dispute because I found the legitimate evidence. They deserve to win." Hale took the credit, I objected, and he protected himself by turning the objection into an accusation. Jonas made notes with the speed of a man who had already decided what was important. "Is there anyone who knew you there? Anyone who could speak to your actual conduct?" "The Homestead family," she said. "A man named Emmett Caldwell, his wife Ruth. They knew what I did for them." A pause. "I don't know if it's been 3 years. They may not want to be involved. Would you write to them?" She thought about Emmett Caldwell's face when the ruling came in, the specific relief of a man who had been so prepared for losing that winning took a moment to register. She thought about Ruth Caldwell pressing her hand outside the county office and saying something she hadn't known how to receive at the time. "Yes," she said, "I'll write." "Good." Jonas closed his folder. "Here's what I want you to understand. Sedgwick is going to make a calculation. His attorney is capable, but Clifford Marsh is also professional. A professional attorney does not want to walk into a courtroom and accuse a woman of fraud unless he has something very solid behind it. What he has is an administrative record from another state and whatever he can imply from it." He looked at her steadily. "What I have is the original survey and a woman who can explain exactly why the amended document is fraudulent. Those are not equal weapons. Unless the judge decides my credibility is the question," Eliza said. "Then we make it about the documents," Jonas said. "Documents don't have reputations. They have measurements. And your measurements are correct." She wrote to the Caldwells that night, at the kitchen table after Nellie was asleep, by the lamp that Nellie had lit before bed, because she did it every evening now without being asked. 2 drafts were dark, wrote 2 drafts and then a third, and the third one said what she needed it to say without asking for more than she had a right to ask for. She sealed it and put it on the table to post in the morning. Silas came in from checking the barn and saw it there. He looked at it, then at her. "Done," she said. He nodded. He got the coffee from the stove, poured a cup, then, without asking, poured a second one, and set it in front of her. He sat down across the table and drank his coffee, and she drank hers, and neither of them said anything, and the lamp burned between them. It was one of the most companionable silences she'd ever sat in, and she did not examine it. She finished her coffee, said good night, and went to bed, where she lay awake for 40 minutes thinking about survey markers and fraud and a county hearing in 14 days, and told herself that was all she was thinking about. The second week of January was when things got ugly. The first sign was a conversation Silas had at the feed store. He came home quieter than usual, which was a specific kind of quiet, different from his regular kind, and she told her then to push but left the space for him to get there when he was ready. He got there after supper, when Nellie was in bed, and the kitchen was cleaned up, and they were both at the table with nothing particular in front of them. "Garland said something today," he said. She waited. He said, "Sedgwick's been talking. Around town." Silas's jaw was doing the thing. Saying that he's heard the challenge to his claim is based on analysis done by a woman who was dismissed from a land office in Colorado for fraudulent conduct. He's saying it in a way that he's not making a direct accusation. He's just putting it in the air. She sat with that for a moment. "When did this start?" she said. "Couple days ago, according to Garland." "He waited," she said. "He found the information and he waited for the right timing. Close enough to the hearing that it damages, but not so far out that Jonas has time to fully answer it." Silas looked at her. You expected this. I expected something like it. You didn't tell me. I told you he was looking, she said. I told you he'd use what he found. That's not the same thing. She looked at the table. He was right. The difference between I expect he'll use it, and here is specifically what he is going to do, was a difference she had covered with tactical language, because some part of her had not wanted to say out loud, he is going to destroy your confidence in me before the hearing. That was harder to say. It required acknowledging that his confidence in her was something she was afraid to lose. You're right, she said. I'm sorry. Silas was quiet for a moment. It's not working, he said. She looked up. Whatever he's trying to do, Silas said. It's not working. Garland told me what Sedgwick was saying, and he told me in a way that made clear he didn't believe it. Mr. Pete stopped me on the street this afternoon and said, he paused. He said, don't let them shake you, that was all. He turned his cup in his hands. The town knows more about what you've done here than Sedgwick seems to think they do. The wood, the cellar, the fact that Nellie, he stopped. Nellie wasn't doing well. Before you came. The town saw that, even if they didn't say anything, and now she stopped again. She's doing better, Eliza said quietly. She laughed last week, he said, out loud. I didn't realize how long it had been since I'd heard that. The kitchen was very still. Sedgwick is not winning the argument he thinks he's winning, Silas said. Not in this town. Not right now, she believed him, mostly. She also knew that not winning the argument in town and not winning the argument at a county hearing were different things, and that courts ran on evidence and procedure rather than on who Bracken Hollow had decided to trust. But she took what he was offering, which was a different thing from the facts. It was a statement of where he stood, clear and unambiguous, and she had not had many of those in her life, and was not going to pretend she didn't feel the weight of it. Thank you, she said, and meant it more than the 2 words could carry. The answer from the Caldwells came 6 days before the hearing, which was faster than she'd hoped, and by then also badly needed. It was from Ruth Caldwell, 2 pages in a tight round handwriting, and it said a number of things that Eliza had to read twice because she could not at first trust that she was reading them correctly. Ruth said that she and Emmett had spoken of Eliza often over the years, that they had always known what she'd done for them and what it had cost her, that they had tried, when they understood what Hale was doing, to speak on her behalf, and that Hale had made sure their voices went nowhere. That, when they heard she had left Colorado, they had felt the specific guilt of people who had benefited from someone else's suffering without being able to prevent it. Ruth said, we would have moved mountains to reach you if we'd known where you'd gone. You did right by us when doing right cost you everything. If our testimony can help you now, we will give it without hesitation. She sat at the kitchen table with that letter for a long time. Nellie came in, looked at her face, and climbed onto the chair beside her without being asked. She didn't say anything. She put Mabel on the table and sat, present and small and quietly, completely there, in the way children sometimes are when they understand something is serious without knowing what it is. Eliza put her arm around her. Good news? Nellie said. Yes, Eliza said. Good news. She got the letter to Jonas that afternoon. He read it, made 3 quick notes, and said, I'll take a written deposition by post. It won't be testimony in person, but it's corroboration, and it speaks to a pattern. Marsh will have to decide whether attacking it helps him more than it costs him. He looked up. Good, Eliza. This is very good. She nodded. One more thing, he said. He was choosing his words with some care. She could see it. Sedgwick's attorney filed a motion yesterday. He wants the court to consider your background as relevant to the credibility of the survey analysis. She had been expecting something. She hadn't known exactly what shape. How is Jonas handling it? Silas said. He'd come with her. I filed a counter motion, Jonas said, arguing that the fact may speak for themselves and that the analysis is either correct or insults it isn't, regardless of who performed it. If the original document shows a different boundary than Sedgwick's amended filing, that is a fact of public record independent of any individual's credibility. Will it hold? Silas said. Probably not completely, Jonas said. Marsh will get some latitude to question the analysis. But I don't need to keep him out of it. I just need the original document in front of the judge and a clear explanation of what it shows. He looked at Eliza. You've been in a courtroom before. Adjacent to one, she said. I've sat in on hearings. Then you know that a judge who is presented with a physical document and a clear explanation of what it demonstrates does not need to decide who to believe. He needs to decide what the document says. He folded his hands. Can you explain the discrepancy clearly? In plain language, without reference to technical terminology that would require specialized knowledge to follow. Yes, she said. Then we go to the hearing and we let the survey do the talking, Jonas said. The night before the hearing, the farmhouse was quieter than usual. Nellie had gone to bed without argument unusual, but Eliza could hear her moving around upstairs, the small, restless sounds of a child who had absorbed the tension in the house without being told anything specific. Eventually, the sounds stopped, and the silence had the different quality of actual sleep. Silas was in the parlor. She could see the light under the door, the particular steady quality of a lamp rather than a candle. She stood in the hallway for a moment, then knocked. "Come in," he said. He was sitting in his chair, not the woman's chair by the window, which remained angled exactly as it had been when she arrived, undisturbed, with a glass of whiskey on the table beside him and the worn philosophy book closed on his knee. Not reading, just sitting. She sat down across from him. "How are you doing?" she asked. He looked slightly surprised by the question, as if he hadn't expected to be asked. "I don't know," he said, which was, she suspected, the most honest answer he could have given. "I've been through worse, objectively. Subjectively is the part that matters right now," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I keep thinking about what happens if we don't win. Jonas says, I know what Jonas says. I'm talking about what actually happens." He turned the glass on the table. "Without that water, the East Field doesn't plant in spring. Without the East Field, I'm running this farm at 2/3 capacity. 2 bad summers after that, and I'm having a different conversation with a different banker." He paused. Nellie would... He stopped. "She's lost enough." The way he said it, the specific flatness of a man, something he could not allow himself to feel fully landed in Eliza's chest, with a precision that made it difficult to breathe normally. "She hasn't lost anything yet," Eliza said. "Tomorrow she might. Then tomorrow we deal with tomorrow." She met his eyes. "But I need you to hear me on this. What I found in that recorder's office is real. The 17 feet are real. Jonas knows how to use it. We have the Caldwell's statement. We are walking into that hearing room with a stronger case than Sedgwick built when he thought no one was looking." He looked at her steadily. "I know what it is to have someone take something from you that was legitimately yours," she said. "I know what it feels like to stand in a room where the deck is stacked and the man across from you is smiling because he thinks he's already won." Her voice stayed level, but only barely. "I also know what it feels like when that smile stops working." Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What did it feel like?" She thought about it honestly. "Like the first time in a long time," she said, "that what was true and what was official were the same thing." He picked up his glass. He didn't drink from it. He held it the way people hold things when they need something in their hands. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "I want you to know something." She waited. "You didn't have to do any of this," he said. "Quarters office, Bell, the Caldwells. You could have kept your head down, kept your past where it was. None of this was your obligation. I hired you to run a house. You hired me to keep your house," she said. "I'm keeping it." Something moved through his face that he didn't try to hide exactly, but didn't put a name to either. He turned the glass in his hands once more. "Set it down. Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be long." She nodded, stood up. She was almost at the door when he said her name, not Miss Renford, which he'd called her at the beginning, and not Eliza in the careful, deliberate way he'd used it the few times since just her name. Said the way you say the name of something you've gotten used to having. Turned. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." She looked at him for a moment, at the worn chair and the closed book, and the glass he hadn't drunk from, and the man who hadn't let himself fall apart, who had held his 30 seconds every single time, and then put one foot in front of the other, because there was a farm, and there was Nellie, and there was always the next thing to do. "Thank you for letting me," she said. She went to bed. She did not sleep much, which she had expected. She lay in the narrow room off the kitchen and went through the survey documents in her head, point by point, the way she had done hundreds of times in Colorado when she was preparing for a contested filing. She knew every measurement. She knew the exact language of the 1,869 survey Scott. She knew where the river bend was and where the marker should sit, and precisely why Sedgwick's 17 feet were not an approximation or an interpretation, but a deliberate, specific lie. She was ready. She was also afraid. She let herself feel that she had learned the hard way that pretending fear didn't exist was not the same as managing it. The fear was there, and it was specific, not about the documents, not about her own performance, but about what it meant if she got this right. They walked out that courthouse tomorrow with the water rights confirmed and the Rourke farm intact and Sedgwick's claim dismissed. Something in the situation would have shifted in a way that couldn't be shifted back. She would have done something real for these people, something that couldn't be undone or taken away. And the question of whether she stayed or left would no longer be a practical one. It would be personal. And personal was the thing she had driven 14 hours specifically to avoid. She lay in the dark listening to the house breathe, around her the tick of the stove cooling, the particular sound of wind against the window she had stuffed with rope in her second week, the distant sound of one of the horses moving in the barn, and told herself one day at a time, one step at a time, the hearing first, everything else after. In the morning, she got up early and started the stove and made breakfast. Nellie came down still in her nightgown, Mabel in tow, and climbed onto her chair and looked at Eliza across the table with those old young eyes. "Are you going to win today?" she said. Eliza set a plate of toast in front of her. "We're going to try very hard," she said. Nellie arranged Mabel's cloth napkin with the careful ceremony she always brought to this task. She looked at the doll. She looked at Eliza. "Mabel says you're going to win," she said. Mabel is usually right. Eliza looked at the serious face across the table, at the absolute unshakable certainty in it, the kind of certainty that belongs only to children and to people who have stopped hedging their hearts against the possibility of good things. "Tell Mabel thank you," she said. "She knows," Nellie said. An hour later, Silas brought the wagon around, and the three of them drove toward the county seat in the January cold, Nellie between them with Mabel held tight, the farmhouse lamp extinguished behind them, because they had locked up and walked out together and there was no one left to tend it. But when they came back tonight and Eliza made herself think when, not if she would light it herself. She held that thought the whole drive. She held it like a survey marker, fixed and certain, a point from which everything else could be measured. The courthouse steps came into view through the cold morning air, and Victor Swick's good carriage was already there, and Clifford Marsh in his Topeka suit was climbing the steps with his briefcase and the unhurried confidence of a man who had won this before the day started. Eliza watched him. She thought about Arthur Hale in Colorado, who had smiled the same way. She thought about the Caldwell's letter, 2 pages in Ruth's round handwriting, sitting in Jonas Bell's briefcase. She thought about 17 feet. She stepped down from the wagon and straightened her coat and walked toward those courthouse steps with Silas on one side, and Nellie's small hand finding hers on the other, and the cold air hit her face like something clean. And the fear was still there, but it was smaller now than the thing beside it, the thing that didn't have a name yet, but felt, in the January light, like solid ground. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building that smelled like old paper and wood oil, and the particular staleness of a room where difficult things got decided. The hearing room was on the ground floor, not a full courtroom, just a large rectangular space with a judge's bench at one end, 2 tables facing it, and a row of chairs along the back wall that had already collected a quiet cluster of Bracken Hollow residents by the time Eliza, Silas, and Nellie came through the door. She hadn't expected the audience. She should have. Small towns had a relationship with their own drama that operated with the efficiency of a postal system. But seeing them there, Mr. Pete near the wall, Mr. Garland from the feed store, the Haverstock woman in a good wool coat, 6 or 7 others she recognized from services and streets, and the particular geography of a place that had spent 2 months deciding what it thought of her, landed differently than she'd prepared for. These people had come to watch. Some of them were hoping she'd fail. She didn't know the proportions and couldn't afford to spend time calculating them. Jonas Bell was already at their table, papers arranged with the organized precision that she had come to recognize as his version of calm under pressure. He looked up when they came in, gave Eliza a single nod that said both "I'm ready" and "I need you to be," and turned back to his preparation. Sedgwick was at the opposite table. Was at opposite table. She hadn't seen him since the morning he'd come to the farm and stood in the doorway looking through her like she was a minor inconvenience in his entrance. He was the good coat, the brass watch chain, the particular ease of a man who had spent his life in rooms where the outcome was arranged before the discussion began. Clifford Marsh sat beside him, sorting papers with practiced efficiency, a slim man in his 40s whose face had the professional blankness of someone paid to make arguments he may or may not believe. Marsh looked up. His eyes moved to Eliza with a brief, assessing quality, measuring an opponent rather than dismissing one. That was something she supposed. He'd been told about her. Sedgwick didn't look at her at all, which was its own kind of statement. Nellie had stationed herself in the back row of chairs, with Mabel arranged on her lap with the seriousness of a small person attending to official business. Mr. Pete had sat down beside her. She wasn't sure when that had happened, and Nellie was explaining something to him in a low, urgent voice that involved pointing at Mabel. He was listening with apparent gravity. Eliza felt something briefly unclench in her chest. Silas sat beside her at their table. He was in his good coat, the dark one, the one he wore to services, and he had shaved that morning, which was not something he did every day. He sat straight, the way men sit when they are determined not to show how much they need something, and he did not look at Sedgwick, which Eliza thought was the right choice. When the judge comes in, Jonas said quietly, leaning toward them, "Do not react to anything Marsh says. He'll make his opening arguments, and some of it will be directed at making you respond. Don't." He looked at Eliza specifically. "Same for you. If he addresses the Colorado matter, let me handle it." "What if the judge asks me directly?" she said. "Answer clearly and briefly. No more than the question requires." He paused. "You know your material. Trust it." She nodded. Judge Alderman arrived 2 minutes later. He was older than she'd expected, somewhere in his late 60s, with a white beard trimmed to a working rather than ornamental length, and the particular deliberateness of a man who has been moving slowly on purpose for a long time. He sat down, adjusted his papers, looked at the room over his spectacles, and said, "Let's get on with it." No preamble. She liked him immediately. Marsh went first. He was good. Jonas had said he was good, and he was right. The opening argument was clean and structured, taking the position that Sedgwick's amended survey was the controlling document because it incorporated a technical correction to a measurement error in the original 1,869 filing, and that the boundary as established by the amended document placed the parcel line east of the creek, granting Sedgwick legal water rights. He spoke for 11 minutes. He used the word legitimate 4 times. He did not look at Eliza once during his opening. Jonas went second. He was more spare 10 minutes. The original survey as his anchor, the discrepancy in the boundary marker reference as his central argument, the position that the amended document could not be reconciled with an 18-year-old public record, and that the burden was on the claimant to demonstrate that the original filing contained the error being claimed. He put both documents on the table in front of the judge. He spoke about the river bend. He spoke about 17 feet. He did not mention Eliza. Judge Alderman looked at both documents for a long, silent moment. Then he looked up. "Mr. Bell," he said, "how did you come to identify this discrepancy?" Jonas said, "Through the analysis of a person with significant experience in land office procedure, Your Honor. I can qualify that person for the court if you wish." "I wish," said the judge. Jonas looked at Eliza. She stood up. She had known this was coming. She had prepared for it. That did not make standing up in front of a room full of people who had been discussing her character for 2 months feel like anything other than what it was. Jonas walked her through the qualifications, the 4 years at the land office, the specific nature of her work, her familiarity with survey filings and parcel boundary documentation in the careful, building way of a man establishing a foundation 1 brick at a time. She answered each question the way she'd answered questions in professional settings, her whole adult life, directly, without embellishment, with the specific concrete language of someone describing what they actually know. Marsh objected twice. Both times the judge overruled him. Then the judge said, "Miss Renford, explain to me in plain language what you found." She took a breath. She thought, documents, not people. Facts, not argument. The original 1,869 survey establishes the eastern Tongue Parcel boundary by reference to a creek marker, she said. The marker is described as being set at the natural limestone outcropping at the north bend of Harrow Creek, a fixed natural landmark that any surveyor working that land would have used because it's the most stable reference point in that section. The original document places the boundary line 43 feet west of that marker. Ms. Sedgwick's amended filing uses the same language, the same reference to the limestone outcropping, but places the boundary line 60 feet west of it. The difference between 43 feet and 60 feet is 17 feet. That 17 feet is what moves the parcel line from the west bank of the creek to the east bank. The room was very quiet. The original document has been in the county record for 18 years without challenge, she continued. Mr. Sedgwick's amended filing was submitted 9 months ago. The amendment claims to be correcting a measurement error in the original survey. But the original survey's reference point, the limestone outcropping, is a permanent natural feature that can be physically verified. It has not moved. The question of whether the boundary marker sits 43 feet from it or 60 feet from it is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of measurement. Judge Alderman looked at the documents again. He looked at her. Are you saying the measurement in the amended filing is wrong, or that it was deliberately wrong? She paused. One beat. I'm saying it is wrong, she said. The determination of whether it became wrong accidentally or intentionally is beyond what I can establish from the documents themselves. She sat down. Jonas touched her arm once, a brief professional contact that said, "Well done," and turned back to the judge. Marsh was on his feet before Jonas had settled back into his chair. Your Honor, I would like the court to consider the matter of Miss Renford's professional history before accepting her analysis as credible. The judge looked at him. Proceed. Marsh spoke for 6 minutes about the Colorado administrative record. He kept his voice measured and his language professional. He did not say fraud outright, but he used the words inconsistency, dismissal, and formal finding 3 times each, in an arrangement that made them mean fraud without requiring him to stake his own credibility on the word. He submitted a copy of the administrative record from Garfield County, Colorado. He placed it on the judge's bench with the specific care of a man, placing a card that he believes wins the hand. Then he said, given this history, the court should consider whether the analysis Miss Renford has provided represents an objective reading of the survey documents or an outcome engineered to benefit the party she is working for. Eliza kept her face still. She had practiced this. She looked at the table in front of her and kept her hands flat on it and breathed. The judge looked at the Colorado record. He looked at it for a while. Then he looked at Jonas, Mr. Bell. Jonas stood. He submitted the Caldwell's written statement. He explained its contents, Ruth Caldwell's account of the original Colorado dispute, the nature of Eliza's actual conduct, the circumstances of her departure in the same patient-building way he built everything. He also submitted, which Eliza had not known was coming, a brief letter from the Homestead family's attorney in the original Colorado case, a man named Birch, who had since moved his practice to Denver, which stated plainly that Eliza Renford's analysis in that dispute had been accurate, professionally conducted, and ultimately vindicated by the outcome. The Gosper mourned, and that her departure from the Garfield County office had followed a disagreement with her supervisor over the attribution of that work. Jonas had written to Birch without telling her. She absorbed that fact with something between surprise and gratitude that she did not have the composure to fully feel right now. He looked up from his papers and addressed the judge directly. Colorado matter and the survey analysis. Before this court are separate questions, Your Honor. Either the original 1,869 survey places the boundary marker 43 feet from the limestone outcropping, or it does not. Miss Renford's professional history does not change what the document says. We ask the court to look at the document. The judge looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time, the kind of looking that is actually reading, careful and unhurried. He looked at Sedgwick's amended filing. He looked between them. He made a note. He looked again. Marsh stood up. Your Honor, if I may, not right now. Mr. Marsh, the judge said, without looking up. Marsh sat down. Sedgwick shifted in his seat beside him. It was the first movement she had seen from him. Since the hearing began, a small adjustment, a straightening that was trying to look like stillness and not quite achieving it. She noticed it, the way she noticed things from the corner of her vision, without turning to look. The judge set both documents down. Mr. Sedgwick, he said. Sedgwick stood. Your amended filing claims the original survey contained a measurement error. What is your basis for that claim? Sedgwick said, our surveyor reviewed the original filing and identified a discrepancy between the marker placement and the natural landmarks as they currently exist. Who is your surveyor? A name was given. The judge wrote it down. Is this surveyor present today? He was not. The judge made another note. He took off his spectacles and looked at the documents on his bench, without them, a strange and somehow final seeming gesture, as if he were looking at them as plain objects rather than as texts. But then he put the spectacles back on. I am going to take a 30-minute recess, he said. When we reconvene, I will want to address the question of the amended filing's provenance. Mr. Marsh, I would recommend using that time to consider whether your client wishes to maintain his current position. Marsh's expression did not change. Sedgwick's did only slightly, only at the edges, but she saw it. The judge stood, and the room stood with him, and then he was gone through the door behind the bench, and the room exhaled. Eliza sat very still. Jonas leaned toward her and said quietly, he's going to rule in our favor. You don't know that, she said. I've been in front of Alderman 11 times, Jonas said. When he tells the opposing attorney to reconsider his client's position, he has already made his decision. He's giving Marsh the opportunity to withdraw because he doesn't want to issue a finding that carries fraud implications, if he doesn't have to. Cleaner. She looked at him. Trust the survey, he said. She turned to look at Silas. He was looking at her. His face was doing the controlled thing, the 30-second thing, but his eyes were different. Not calm, not certain, something rawer than that, something that had been running under everything this whole morning, and was now closer to the surface because the ground had shifted and even careful men lose their footing. Jonas thinks it's going our way, she said. Silas didn't say anything for a moment. Then, how sure is he? Sure enough. He looked at the table. He nodded if its windows were dark. He nodded once, a single, private nod, the kind you give when you're receiving information that is too large to immediately process and need to put it somewhere until you have the capacity to deal with it properly. From across the room, Nellie's voice, Eliza. She turned. Nellie was on her feet in the back row, Mabel held up for visibility. Mabel wants to know what's happening. Several of the Bracken Hollow observers looked at the child and then at Eliza with the particular expression of people who are being reminded that this situation has dimensions beyond the legal one. Tell Mabel we're waiting, Eliza said. And that good things sometimes take a little longer than we'd like. Nellie reported this to Mabel with solemn precision, then sat back down. Mr. Pete, beside her, said something that made her look up at him, and then almost smile a near smile, the tentative approach of a child who has not yet fully given herself permission. During the recess, Eliza stood at the window at the back of the room and looked out at the January Street, the main road of the county seat, ice-rimed wagon tracks in the dirt, a hardware store and a land office, and two bare-limbed trees in front of the courthouse that would be green by April. She stood there and did not think about Colorado, or surveys, or the hearing. She thought about the East Field in spring. She had not seen it. She'd arrived in November, and the field had been dormant under its first frost, but Silas had described it once in passing, without sentiment, as a working description, the soil quality, the water access from the creek, what it could produce in a good year. She had constructed a picture from that description, and she had put the picture somewhere in the back of in the place where she kept things she did not yet have permission to want. She had been constructing that picture for weeks. She heard Marcia's voice behind her, not to her, not to anyone in particular, the low, urgent consultation of a man and his client recalibrating behind cupped hands. She did not turn around. She did not need to hear it. She knew what it sounded like when the calculation changed. When the judge returned, the room resettled. Marsh stood before he was asked to. Your Honor, my client has asked me to convey that in light of the court's questions regarding the amended filing's provenance, he is prepared to withdraw the current submission pending further documentation of the survey basis. The judge looked at him. Mr. Marsh, are you withdrawing the claim? A pause, very brief. The length of a man swallowing something. Yes, Your Honor. The room did something, a collective intake, a small specific noise that was not quite a sound, just a change in the quality of the air. Eliza felt Silas go still beside her in a way that was different from all his previous stillnesses. This one was release rather than containment. Given the discrepancy identified between the amended filing and the established public record, the judge said, addressing the room rather than either party specifically, this court notes for the rec that the original 1,869 survey remains the controlling document for the parcel boundary in question. The water rights associated with Harrow Creek within Section 14 remain with the recorded holder of that parcel. Mr. Rourke's rights to that water access are confirmed. He set down his pen. We're adjourned, he said, and stood, and that was the end of it. For approximately 2 seconds, nothing happened. The kind of nothing that follows something large where the room hasn't yet remembered how to be ordinary. Then Jonas Bell's hand was on Silas's shoulder, saying something close and practical, and Silas was nodding in the focused way of a man receiving information he needs to process and file, and around the room the Bracken Hollow contingent was doing the various things people do when a situation came to observe has resolved itself more cleanly than expected. Eliza sat at the table. Her hands were flat on the surface. She looked at them. They were steady, which surprised her, because the rest of her was doing something complicated and involuntary that she did not immediately have a name for. Not quite relief. Not quite the thing she'd felt outside the Caldwell's hearing in Colorado when the ruling came in. Something personal than those. Something more personal than those. Something that had more to do with Nellie's Eastfield picture in the back of her mind and the lamp in the kitchen window than with survey markers. Someone touched her shoulder. She looked up. It was Silas. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at her with the directness he used for things that were true and couldn't be made smaller. Then he said, "It's over." "It's over," she agreed. "You did that," he said. "Jonas used what you found," he said. "You found it." She looked up at him, the dark coat, the careful, controlled face, something underneath it that was no longer being quite so carefully controlled now that the room had given him permission to let it be less controlled. 3 years ago, she would have deflected this. Even a month ago, she might have deflected it. She had a long and practiced history of making herself smaller when someone offered her the accurate size. She said, "I did." He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then Nellie materialized at his elbow, appearing with the instantaneous quality of a child who has been waiting at the edge of something and has decided the waiting is over. She looked at her father. She looked at Eliza. She looked at the room, which still had the particular charged quality of a space where something significant had just ended. "Did we win?" she said. "We won," Silas said. Nellie looked at Mabel. She delivered this verdict to the doll with the formality of an official communique. Then she looked up at Eliza and did something she had never done. Before she reached out and took Eliza's hand, both of her small hands around one of Eliza's, the way children hold things they are not going to let go of, and she said, "Mabel said you would win." Eliza looked down at those hands around hers. She was not going to cry in a courthouse. She was not going to cry in front of Mrs. Haverstock, who had drifted closer and was watching the scene with an expression that had lost most of its earlier certainty. She was absolutely not going to do that. She squeezed Nellie's hands. Mabel was right, she said. Outside the courthouse, the January air hit them like clarity. Sedgwick's carriage was already gone. He had moved with the speed of a man who understood that lingering at a public defeat was a tactical error, which was the most professional thing about him. Marsh had packed his briefcase with the particular economy of motion of a man who had known this was coming for the last 30 minutes and had been quietly preparing to be somewhere else. Jonas walked them to the street. He was in good spirits, the specific good spirits of a man who has done his job well and knows it, which were different from and more satisfying than ordinary good spirits. He shook Silas's hand for a long time. He told Eliza that she would have been an exceptional attorney. She told him she'd look into it, which wasn't true, but was the right thing to say and made him laugh. Then he said, more quietly, just to her, "The Colorado record isn't going to follow you here. Not after today. Whatever happened there, it's documented differently now. Birch's letter is in the county record. The Caldwell's statement is in the county record. What's in this county record is what matters in this county." She looked at him. "Thank you," she said, "for writing to Birch. You didn't tell me you were doing that." "I didn't know if he'd respond," Jonas said. "I didn't want to raise your hopes." She thought about that. About a man who had worked on her behalf in the background without announcement. because he'd decided it was the right thing to do, and announcing it would require her to feel something about it before she knew if it would matter. Good instinct, she said. He smiled and put his hat on, and Smouser, Nord Kmadhaus, and they were standing on the courthouse step, cold, her and Silas and Nellie, who had repositioned Mabel under one arm and taken possession of Silas's hand with the other. Mrs. Haverstock appeared at Eliza's elbow. She hadn't been invited. She arrived the way she always arrived, with the particular social confidence of a woman who has been certain of her position in every room she's ever entered and has not yet fully revised that certainty. But something in her was different today. The bright, specific quality of her usual manner had taken on a slightly uncertain edge. The look of someone whose understanding of a situation has been complicated by events and is still deciding what to do with the complication. She said, "Miss Renford, Mrs. Haverstock." A pause. Brief. "That was," she said, and then seemed to reconsider whatever she had started to say and revised it. "That was well done." Eliza looked at her steadily. She thought about the visit with the cookies that left, with the tin. She thought about the bright specific way the woman had said, a woman without family, without connections here. She thought about 2 months of Bracken Hollow's collected opinion, pressing against her from every direction. "Thank you," she said, not warmly, but without hostility either. Honest. The way you accept a thing when you are neither going to refuse it nor pretend it is more than it is. Mrs. Haverstock nodded a small movement, correct and slightly uncomfortable, the nod of a woman who understood she was receiving accuracy rather than grace, and found it fair, and stepped back into the cluster of townspeople doing their own recalculating in the courthouse's shadow. Mr. Garland from the feed store had come out. He stopped on the steps and said to Silas, "Simply good." One word. He seemed to mean it. Mr. Pete, who had come out with Nellie still in tow, she had apparently adopted him. As her official courthouse escort looked at Eliza with those old direct eyes and said nothing at all. He just gave her a single deliberate nod, the kind you give when words would be smaller than what you mean, and turned and walked back toward the post office. It was enough. More than enough. Silas got the wagon. Nellie climbed up without being asked, settling herself in the middle with Mabel arranged across her knees with the satisfaction of someone who has attended an important event and acquitted herself well. Silas helped Eliza up. He had never done that before, the casual, ordinary helpfulness of a hand on a cold morning, and then climbed up himself, and the three of them sat in a row, Nellie between them, and turned toward home. For a while no one said anything. The road was rutted, and the horses picked their way through it, with the patient efficiency of animals that know the way without being told, and the January sky was the color of pewter again, and the fields on either side were frozen and bare and waiting for something warmer to do anything with them. Then Nellie said, out of nowhere, "Conversationally, Papa." Said Silas. "Can we keep her?" The wagon kept moving. The horse's breath made small clouds in the cold. From somewhere behind them, the county seat thinned out into fields, and the fields stretched east toward the farm and the creek that was theirs now, confirmed and undisputed, with the limestone outcropping exactly where it had always been. Eliza felt Silas look across the top of Nellie's head at her. She was looking straight ahead at the road. She could feel the look without meeting it. "Who?" Silas said. His voice was carefully neutral. "Eliza," Nellie said, with the specific impatience of a child explaining something that should be obvious. She held up Mabel for emphasis, and Mabel says we should. Mabel likes her. "Mabel's an excellent judge of character," Silas said. "Pause," Nellie said. Silas was quiet for a moment. The road curved and the horses followed it. "That," he said slowly, "is a conversation for Eliza to have a say in." Nellie turned to look at Eliza directly, with the full force of a 4-year-old's undivided attention, which was considerable. Eliza kept her eyes on the road for one more second. Then she looked down at Nellie, at the round, serious face, and the dark braids and the doll held aloft like evidence, and the absolute uncalculating certainty of a child who had decided, somewhere between a pulled-out chair and a small saucer at supper, and 2 months of being seen when she hadn't been seen for a long time, that this was how things were and should be, and she was simply making it official. "Mabel's opinion carries a lot of weight with me," Eliza said. Nellie looked at Mabel. She looked at Eliza. Something in her face settled, not surprised. Exactly. But confirmed. The way things look, when they matched the shape of what you'd already decided was true. She leaned without ceremony against Eliza's side. Eliza put her arm around her. Silas drove and said nothing, and the look on his face was not something he was trying to control. It was just there, open and real in the cold January air, the look of a man who has lost a great deal and knows it, and has just seen, on an ordinary wagon road between a courthouse and a farm, something he hadn't let himself count on. The farmhouse appeared ahead of them as the road straightened, cold and plain and real, with the lamp unlit behind the kitchen window, and the woodpile where it should be, and the east fence line running straight in the bare winter light. Their water, their land, their farm. Nellie was asleep against Eliza's side. Before they reached the gate, was still loosely gripped in one hand, having apparently decided that the official business of the day was complete and rest was appropriate. She was heavy and warm against Eliza's ribs, in the way of a child who has stopped performing sleep and given into it entirely. Silas drove through the gate and up to the house and brought the horses to a stop. He didn't move for a moment, just sat looking at the farmhouse with an expression that was too private to catalog and too visible to ignore. Eliza said quietly, so as not to wake Nellie, "Are you all right?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "I haven't been sure this place was going to be mine, to keep for the better part of a year." A pause. Strange having it settled. Strange good or strange hard. He thought about it. Both, he said. Right now, both. She understood that. Relief was not a simple feeling. It had edges. It was made partly of the fear that had preceded it, and you couldn't have the relief without also having the shadow of what it would have been if things had gone the other way, and sometimes the two sat side by side, and you had to hold them both at the same time. "Come on," she said. "Let's get her inside." He took Nellie, extracted her from the wagon with the total gentleness she'd seen that first snowstorm night, the child's head settling against his shoulder without waking, and carried her through the front door. Eliza followed, lit the lamp in the kitchen first, because that was the thing you did when you came home, and then put the kettle on, because there were some situations that coffee improved, and this was one of them. When Silas came back downstairs, Nellie deposited in her bed, which would take approximately 45 minutes to result in an awake child, demanding supper. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Eliza at the stove with an expression that had none of his usual containment in it. She turned to look at him. She thought she should say something practical. There was plenty to say. About the spring planting now that the Eastfield water was confirmed, about the fence work that needed doing, about the 100 ordinary things that had been waiting on the other side of this day. She said none of them. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. And what happened next was not graceful. His hand found her face, and he misjudged the angle slightly, and their foreheads came together before anything else did, which was awkward and entirely human, and probably exactly right. And she felt him exhale against her hair like a man setting something heavy down after a very long time carrying it. She kept her hands flat against his chest. She felt his heartbeat, faster than it should have been, for a man standing still in his own kitchen. "Eliza," he said against her hair. "Don't make it a speech," she said. She felt him almost law, the particular tremor of something that would have been a laugh if it had also been several other things at the same time. "I wasn't going to make it a speech," he said. "Good," she said. "I'm making coffee." He pulled back enough to look at her. She let him look. She didn't have the energy to be careful right now, not after the courthouse, not after the survey and the hearing, and Marcia's polished voice, and Nellie's hands around hers, and 30 miles of cold road, and what she felt was probably visible, and she was going to let it be visible because she was so tired of carrying things in the place where they couldn't be seen. "I meant what I said before," he said. "Whatever you had to leave behind in Colorado, whatever that man did. It doesn't, that's not," he stopped. He was not good at this. She could see him working for the words, which was somehow more affecting than if he'd been easy with them. "What I see is what's here in this house, what you've done here." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "You showed me that. In the wagon when I told you. You showed me." She paused. "That meant more than you know." He looked at her steadily. "Good," he said. "Because I meant it to." The kettle was beginning to make noise behind her. She turned back to it. She poured the coffee. She set 2 cups on the table, their table. She thought it, without bracing against the thought. Their table in their kitchen in their house at the end of the day they'd been working toward for 2 months. She sat down. He sat down across from her. Outside the window, the east field lay under its winter cover, dormant and waiting. The creek ran through it somewhere beyond the fence line, cold and steady, and exactly where it had always been, 43 feet from a limestone outcropping that had not moved in 18 years and would not move now. Its windows were dark. In the spring there would be planting. In the spring the fields would be green and the fence would be rebuilt and the farm would go forward into whatever it was going to be. All of that was on the other side of a winter that still had months in it. But the lamp was burning, the coffee was hot. And upstairs, in a few minutes, a 4-year-old would wake up and demand supper and report on everything Mabel thought about the day's proceedings, and it would be ordinary, and it would be real. And Eliza Renford, who had arrived in November, carrying one carpet bag and no intention of staying, was going to be there for it. She wrapped both hands around her cup. She looked at the lamp. She let herself feel the full weight of the day, the whole complicated human tangle of it, the fear and the courthouse, and Nellie's hands and Silas' forehead against hers, and the specific warmth of the kitchen, and the sound of the horses in the barn, settling for the evening. She didn't try to put any of it somewhere smaller. It was hers, all of it. For the first time in 3 years, something was hers. The days after the hearing had a different quality than the days before it. Before, everything had been organized around a point in the future, the January 14th date that Nellie's penciled X's were marching toward, the document in Jonas Bell's briefcase, the thing that needed to happen before anything else could. The farm had been running on the compressed energy of a household holding its breath. Eliza had felt it in the way Silas moved through the barn chores in the morning, efficient but with a tightness underneath it, the way he sometimes sat at the table in the evenings with his coffee gone cold and his eyes somewhere the coffee wasn't. The hearing had been a wall they couldn't see past. Now they were past it. And the days on the other side of that wall turned out to be quieter than Eliza expected, and more complicated, and in some ways harder, because when the urgent thing resolves itself, the space it leaves behind gets filled by everything you had set aside until after, and after is its own kind of reckoning. The first thing that came into the space was winter. Just winter, the plain, relentless fact of it, with its daily demands and its indifference to human dramatic arcs. Cattle needed feeding. The ice needed breaking. The woodpile needed replenishing at a rate that made the previous restacking feel optimistic. Eliza went back to the work of keeping the house the way she had gone back to every difficult thing in her life by doing the next task, and then the next one, because forward motion was the only thing she had ever found that reliably outpaced the thoughts that came when she stood still. But she was standing still more than she used to. She noticed it on the third morning after the hearing, when she found herself at the kitchen window with the coffee getting cold in her hand, looking out at the east field at the fence line, running across the bare frozen ground, at the place where the creek ran, somewhere, beyond the tree line at the white January light on everything, and realizing she had been standing there for a good 10 minutes without any practical justification for it. She was just looking. She was just letting herself look at the thing that was theirs and feel what that felt like, without converting the feeling into a task or a calculation or a reason for action. She was just standing in a kitchen that was warm, because she had built the fire correctly, in a house that was in order because she had put it in order, looking at land that had been protected, partly, because she had understood something about a survey document, and she was letting the whole accumulated weight of that land on her. It was not comfortable, exactly, but it was real. And she had developed, in the years since Colorado, a particular respect for real things, even when they were uncomfortable, because real things were the only kind you could actually stand on. Silas noticed she was at the window when he came in from the barn. He came in, stomped snow from his boots, and said nothing, poured himself coffee, sat down at the table, and waited with the patience of a man who understood that some things needed to be left alone until they were ready. She appreciated that about him. She had come to appreciate a great deal about him, in the incremental way that you appreciate things you have had time to observe rather than things that announce themselves. "I was thinking about spring," she said finally, turning from the window. "Spring's a ways off," he said. "I know." She sat down across from him with her re-warmed coffee. "I was thinking about the east field. What you said about the soil. What it could yield in a good year." He looked at her over his cup. "You remembered that?" "I remember most things," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "With the water confirmed," he said slowly, like he was still getting used to saying it that way. Confirmed, settled, finished. I can plant the full acreage. I hadn't planned the east field into this year's budget because I didn't know if I'd have it. He turned the cup in his hands. I'll need to recalculate the seed order, the fence work. The east fence needs cedar posts, she said. The existing ones are rotted below the soil line on the south end. I noticed it when the ground was soft in November. He looked at her for a moment. How did you? I was moving the stock for the first freeze, she said. I had time to look. He set his cup down. Something moved across his face, that particular quality she had seen a handful of times. The one that didn't have a name in his usual vocabulary, the one that appeared when she did something that he had not expected from her, and then immediately should have. Eliza, he said, I want to ask you something. She waited. He was doing the thing where he organized his words before he said them, which she had learned to respect even when it made her impatient, because what he eventually said was usually worth the wait. Are you planning to stay? He said. Question was quiet and direct in the way. He was always quiet and direct when something mattered, and it sat on the table between them with the specific weight of something that had been coming for a while and had decided it was done waiting. She looked at him for a long moment. I've been staying, she said. That's not the same thing, he said. You came for a housekeeper's position. The position is still what it is. But things are... He stopped. Things have changed. Yes, she said. I'm not asking you to decide anything right this moment, he said. I'm asking you what you want, because what you want matters to me, and I don't know if I've been clear about that, and I don't want to. He paused. I don't want you making decisions based on what you think the situation requires of you. I want to know what you actually want. She looked at the table. She looked at the window. She looked at the lamp, which was burning because Nellie had lit it before school. She had started going to the small schoolhouse in town 2 weeks ago, a development she had initially resisted and then embraced with the focused intensity she brought to everything she decided to do. She looked at Silas. I want to stay, she said. Not because she felt she should say it, not as an answer to a question about the practical arrangement. Plain truth of it said plainly, I want to stay here. I want to see the east field in spring. I want to... She stopped because she was about to say something about Nellie and what it did to her when Nellie climbed onto the chair beside her without being asked, and she wasn't sure she could say that without her voice doing something she hadn't authorized. I want to stay, she said again, which covered it. Silas looked at her for a moment. Then he said, good. That was all. Just good. But the way he said it made the word carry a great deal more than its usual 4 letters, and she understood from the way he picked his coffee cup back up and turned to look at the window himself that the conversation was complete, not because it had been cut short, but because it had said what it needed to say, and the rest was implied. They sat in the kitchen with the fire going, and the winter outside, and the coffee between them, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else, and that was its own kind of answer. The wedding was Silas's idea, which surprised her. She wasn't sure what she had expected, actually. Soat's windows were dark. She had been so occupied with staying that she hadn't gotten far into the question of what staying looked like in its formal and official dimensions. She had been thinking about it the way you think about something you want, but can't quite believe is available to you from the corner of your eye, without looking directly. He brought it up on an evening in late January, 2 weeks after the hearing, while she was mending a coat sleeve, and he was working on a piece of harness at the other end of the table. Nellie was asleep. The house had the particular quiet of a cold evening with everyone where they should be. He said, I'd like to marry you, if you'd be willing. Kept her eyes on the mending for 1 full second. Then she looked up. He was looking at her straight on the way he looked at things he wasn't going to flinch from, the 30-second way, except this time there were no 30 seconds, because he was not containing something, he was saying it. You'd like to, she said. Yes. That's not... She stopped. Silas, that's not much of a proposal. No, he agreed. It's not a pause. I'm not a man who's good at speeches. You told me not to make it a speech, he held her eyes. What I can tell you is that I have not thought about this lightly, and I have not thought about it as a practical arrangement, and I am asking you because I. He stopped, started again. You are the most capable person I have ever known, And you make this house feel like what it was supposed to feel like. And I am asking you because I want to, not because it makes sense, or because it's convenient, or because of any other reason." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're still not good at speeches," she said. "No," he said. "It was still honest," she said. "Yes," he said. She put down the mending. She looked at her hands. She thought about Colorado and Arthur Hale and the long specific geometry of the distance she had put between herself and anyone who might use the useful parts of her against her. She thought about what it had cost and what it had protected, and whether what it had protected was worth what it had cost. She thought about Nellie's hands around hers in the courthouse. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." He didn't do anything theatrical about it. He just nodded a single slow nod, the same one he'd given when she told him Jonas's analysis had confirmed the survey. The nod of a man receiving confirmation of something important that he had been hoping for without letting himself fully count on. Then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and that was the proposal. It was nothing like what she had imagined proposals to be, when she had imagined such things, which was not often. It was plain and real and slightly awkward and entirely him, and she held his hand across the mending and the harness and the kitchen table and thought, "This is what solid ground feels like, when you've been on unsteady footing long enough to know the difference." They told Nellie in the morning. She was at the table with Mabel when they came downstairs together, which was unusual enough timing that she looked up with immediate attention a child's radar for the specific frequency of adult news. "Silas," said Nellie, "Eliza and I are going to be married." Nellie looked at him. She looked at Eliza. She looked at Mabel. Then she said, with the specific gravity of someone confirming information she had already processed, "I know." Silas blinked. "You know, Mabel told me," Nellie said, and went back to her breakfast. Eliza caught Silas's eye over Nellie's head. His face was doing several things at once, and she felt the laugh building in her chest from a place it had not come from in a very long time, the deep, unguarded kind. Most of its windows were dark, and she turned toward the stove before it could come out fully, so that Nellie wouldn't think they were laughing at Mabel, which would have been a diplomatic incident. The wedding was small. February, the last Saturday of the month, in the parlor of the farmhouse because the roads were uncertain, and neither of them wanted a production. Jonas Bell came. Old Mr. Pete came, which mattered to Eliza more than she'd expected. 3 or 4 others from town, people who had ended up on the right side of 2 months of watching and waiting and recalibrating. There was no ceremony beyond the judge, who came to make it official, who was not Judge Alderman, was a county court judge, and this was not that kind of business, but a younger man who read the words with appropriate seriousness and seemed to understand that the occasion didn't require elaboration. Mrs. Haverstock was not invited. She sent a note the following week that said she wished them well and that she hoped Eliza would consider herself part of Bracken Hollow in the fullest sense. It was gracious and specific way of a woman who has been wrong about something and has decided being wrong about it means. She now has a responsibility to be right about it going forward. Eliza read it twice and appreciated it without quite forgiving it, which seemed like the honest response. Nellie stood beside Eliza during the ceremony holding Mabel, and when the judge reached the part of the proceedings that concluded with the marriage being official, she looked at Mabel with the expression of someone receiving confirmation they had been expecting, and said, in a stage whisper audible to the entire room, "I told you." Mr. Pete made a sound. Jonas Bell coughed into his hand. Silas pressed his lips together with the focused determination of a man who will not laugh in his own wedding ceremony if it kills him. Eliza laughed. She laughed out loud, in the parlor, in front of everyone. And it was nothing like the careful management of expression she had been practicing for 3 years. It was just a laugh, real and unplanned. And Silas looked at her when she did it with an expression that she was going to remember, that specific expression, the one he had when something true happened in front of him, and he let it land, rather than containing it for the rest of her life. The winter passed. It passed the way winters pass, slowly, and then all at once, with false starts and one more hard freeze when everyone had decided they were done with freezes, and then a morning in early March when the quality of the light changed, and the horses noticed before anyone in the house did and made themselves heard about it. Eliza noticed the change in Silas across that period, slow and not always linear, and not something she'd have been able to describe as a single thing. He was not a man who transformed. That was not who he was, not how he worked. But there was something that loosened in him over those months that had been tight for a long time. Something that had to do with sleeping better and laughing more often at things that deserved it. With sitting on the porch for 20 minutes when he could technically be doing something else. With watching Nellie's expanding universe school, opinions about everything. A new and serious interest in the barn cats with the kind of attention that was pleasure rather than vigilance. The particular chair by the window in the parlor was still there, still angled the way it had always been. He didn't move it. Neither did she. She had understood from the beginning that there were things about grief that were not hers to manage, and this was one of them. But sometime in February, she found a small embroidered pillow on the seat of it, not hers, not new, clearly something that had been in storage somewhere, and she left it where it was. Some things in a house are not decorations. They are markers. They say, this person was here, and mattered, and is not forgotten. Eliza respected that. She had come into this home, not to erase what had been in it before her, but to help it keep going forward. That, she thought, was the thing she had taken longest to understand about what she was doing here. She had come thinking about survival, $8 a month, somewhere safe enough to exist without being diminished. She had stayed thinking about usefulness, about work, about the practical ways in which she could justify her presence. She had fought for the farm thinking about justice, about 17 feet and a forged survey, and a man who thought he could take what wasn't his. But she had built something here that was none of those things. It was more ordinary and more durable than any of them. It was dailiness, the specific accumulated weight of morning after morning in the same kitchen, of knowing some habits and being known in yours, of a child who saved you biscuits and reported Mabel's meteorological predictions and had started calling her something that was not quite Mama and not quite Eliza, but was its own word, a contracted, comfortable thing that belonged specifically to the two of them. She thought about her mother once. In March, her own mother, who had died when Eliza was 19, who had been a practical woman with rough hands and a specific kind of humor that surfaced in unexpected places, who had told her once, in the way mothers sometimes accidentally tell their daughters the most important things while doing something mundane, that a life worth living was not a life without difficulty, but a life where the difficulty happened to people who deserved better, and who refused to accept that they didn't. She thought her mother would have liked Silas. She thought her mother would have loved Nellie without reservation, and Nellie would have loved her back. She thought her mother would have had opinions about Mabel. The cedar posts for the east fence arrived from the lumber yard in March. Silas had ordered them weeks ago, budgeted them into the spring plans, with a thoroughness that spoke to a man who no longer needed to hold the east field at arm's length because he didn't know yet if it would be his. He and a hired hand, a young man from town named Decker, who was quiet and capable and had the good sense to follow instructions, without asking for reasons, worked the fence line for a week, pulling the rotted posts and setting the new cedar in the thawed ground. On the fourth day, Eliza brought lunch out to the fence line. She did this partly because they needed the food, and partly because she wanted to see it, the cedar posts in the ground, solid and straight, the line of the fence running east toward the creek. She stood at the edge of the field while Silas and Decker ate, and she looked at the full length of it, the whole long, honest line of it, and felt something she had no name for, except that it had the quality of things that are finished correctly. Well, Silas said. He was watching her look at it. It's a good fence, she said. Rotted ones weren't, he said. No, she agreed, but these will last. She looked at the line going east. Long enough. He looked at her. He understood what she meant. By long enough, she could see it in his face. Long enough meant past them, past this winter and the next one, past Nellie's childhood and through whatever the farm became next. Most of its windows were dark. Long enough meant the kind of building you do when you believe in the future of the thing you're building for. Picked up his coffee. Decker, he said, take the rest of the afternoon. Decker, who was 22 and perceptive enough to know when a conversation was happening that he was not part of, finished his lunch in approximately 45 seconds and was extremely busy with his horse. Silas walked out to the fence line. Eliza walked with him. They stood at the east edge of the field where the creek was visible now, through the bare trees. The late March light on the water, the limestone outcropping on the near bank, exactly where it had always been, 43 feet from the boundary marker, patient and permanent and completely indifferent to everything that had happened in the county courthouse over the winter. "I want to tell you something," Silas said. "All right," she said. He was looking at the creek. "I was wrong about the farm," he said. "Not about the land, about what it was." He paused. "After Margaret died, I thought I told myself this place was about keeping things going. For Nellie, that was the reason. Keep the farm running, keep Nellie fed and housed, keep everything going until—" He stopped. "I don't know. I never had an until. It was just, keep going." She listened. "That's not—" He turned to look at her. "That's not a life. I know that now. I think I knew it then, but knowing it didn't change anything." He looked at the water. "You changed it." She looked at the creek. "I didn't do anything you weren't already doing," she said. "You stayed," he said, "when it would have been easier to go. Not just in November when you first got here. Every time it got harder, you stayed." He paused. "That's not nothing." She thought about all the times she had almost calculated herself out of it. The gossip, the Haverstock visit, the Sedgwick question, the Colorado door, the fear of being useful to someone who might use her usefully and discard the rest. She thought about how many times the leaving would have been logical, and the staying had been something else, something less rational and more stubborn. Something that had to do with a small girl and a rag doll, and a chair pulled out at a table, and the particular quality of a kitchen lamp seen from a cold road. "I stayed," she agreed. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had across the kitchen table in February, simple and direct, and they stood at the edge of the east field, with the creek moving behind its trees, and the cedar fence posts straight and solid in the ground, and the spring sun doing what spring sun does in Kansas when it finally decides to mean it. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in November with one carpetbag and a name on a folded piece of paper. That woman had been trying to survive. She's not been wrong to try. Survival is not a small thing. It takes everything you have, and it takes it daily, and there is nothing shameful about the years when it is the best you can do. But there comes a moment, not a dramatic one, usually, not a courtroom or a declaration, but something quieter, when you realize you have crossed from surviving into something that does not have as clean a name, but is rounder and heavier and costs more, because it requires you to want things, and wanting things requires you to be capable of losing them. And being capable of losing them means admitting that they matter. Things mattered. That was the whole of it, really. Things mattered, and she had let them, and the letting had been the hard part, and she had done it anyway. And here she was. Here she was. April came the way April comes tentatively at first, with cold mornings that suggested winter, had not entirely conceded the point, and then with increasing confidence, the grass pushing up along the south side of the barn, and the trees along the creek going from bare to the first tentative green that always looks too delicate to mean what it means. The east field was planted in the first week of April. Silas had planned it carefully through the winter, months, revised the seed order twice, consulted with 2 other farmers in the county about the soil, amendments the field would need after a year of lying fallow. Eliza had sat in on these conversations, not because she was needed for them, but because she was interested, genuinely, in the language of the land, the way farmers talked about soil and yield and water and timing with the specific intimacy of people in a relationship with something that does not always cooperate. On the day the planting started, Nellie insisted on helping. This was not practically useful. She was 4, and then 5, her birthday falling in mid-March, fact that its windows were dark, a fact that had resulted in a cake and a considerable celebration that Mabel had presided over with dignity appropriate to the occasion, but she had opinions about where specific rows should begin and communicated these opinions with confidence of someone whose views carried weight. "She's wrong about the 3rd row," Silas said quietly to Eliza. They were watching from near the barn. "She's not entirely wrong," Eliza said. "She's off by about 2 feet. He looked at her. "How do you know?" "I walked it this morning." She looked at the field. "You could adjust. It wouldn't hurt anything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he shook his head, which was not disagreement, but something like appreciation, expressed through a gesture he hadn't planned. He went out and told Nellie she had a good eye, that they'd shift the 3rd row 2 feet east. Nellie's expression was the expression of someone who has always known they were right and is pleased, but not surprised to have it confirmed. She reported this to Mabel. Mabel presumably concurred. The spring moved through April and into May. The east field came up green and even. The water from the creek feeding it through the channels, Silas had sussed in the second week of April, with the focused satisfaction of a man doing work he had not been sure he'd get to do. The fence line held. The cedar posts were everything Eliza had said they'd be: solid, straight, built for longer than next season. Victor Sedgwick did not return. He was not seen in Bracken Hollow. He was not heard from by Jonas Bell. He was, as far as anyone could determine, occupied with other projects in other counties, or, more likely, quietly absorbing the fact that his usual arithmetic had failed him and rerouting toward situations where it wouldn't. Men like Sedgwick were not destroyed by single defeats, but they recalculated. They found easier targets, and the Rourke farm, with its confirmed water rights and its cedar fence and the woman who knew how to read a survey document, was no longer an easy target. Jonas Bell sent a note in May. The county had completed its formal registration of the water rights conversion, entered into the permanent record. The Rourke farm's claim to Harrow Creek was documented, official, and publicly accessible. He included a copy of the registration for their records. Silas read it at the kitchen table. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the wooden box on the parlor shelf where he kept the important papers of the farm, the deed, the original mortgage, the tax records, the survey. He put it in there among those other permanent things and closed the box. He did not say anything particular about it. He didn't need to. On a Thursday evening in the second week of May, Silas built a second chair on the porch. It was not a dramatic act. He had been fixing a loose rung on the existing porch chair for 2 weeks, something he did every spring, Eliza had learned, kind of annual maintenance ritual, and when he finished that, he went to the barn for another hour and came back with a second chair that had been stored there, its legs dusty, a small split in one of the back slats that he had repaired, with such precision you had to look for the repair to find it. He set it beside his own, on the porch. He came inside and said nothing about it. After supper, Eliza went out to the porch. She sat in the new chair, his repaired chair was to the left, the new one to the right, and looked out at the field and the sky doing what Kansas skies do in May, which is turn colors that have no names in the ordinary vocabulary. The east field was green in the evening light. The fence posts were clean and straight against the sky. Creek, invisible from here, was somewhere beyond the tree line, doing what it had always done. She heard the screen door and Silas came out and sat in his chair. Nellie appeared 30 seconds later, which was not a coincidence, and sat on the edge of his chair, then looked at the space available, looked at Eliza's lap, and made a logistical decision. She climbed onto Eliza's lap and arranged Mabel beside her with the specific efficiency of someone who has done a cost-benefit analysis and reached a conclusion. Mabel likes the porch, Nellie said. Mabel has good taste, Eliza said. I told her about the field, Nellie said. She thinks it looks nice. It does look nice, Eliza agreed. Silas said nothing. He was looking at the field. The evening was warm enough that he'd left his coat inside, and the sleeves of his shirt were rolled to the forearm the way they were when he'd been working. He looked like what he was, a farmer at the end of a long day, on his own porch, on land that was his and confirmed as his, in the particular uncomplicated moment that exists between the day's last task and the evening's first dark. Nellie fell asleep, somewhere around the time the light changed from gold to the deeper color, because she fell asleep the way she did everything else, decisively and completely, with no warning and no transition. One moment she was explaining something to Mabel about the barn cats, and the next she was a warm weight against Eliza's chest, completely gone. Mabel held loosely in the crook of one arm. Silas looked over. She was tired, he said. She's always tired, Eliza said. She doesn't admit it until she's already asleep. He almost smiled. She gets that from her mother. Quiet moment. Not uncomfortable. He said Margaret's name sometimes now, not often, not constantly. But sometimes, as you say the name of someone who is no longer here, but who has not been erased from the record of things that happened and mattered. Eliza had learned to receive those moments without flinching. Receiving them without flinching was, she had come to understand, one of the things that made the difference between someone who helped a family heal and someone who demanded that healing look a certain way. She was not Margaret. She was not trying to be. She was Eliza, who had come in November with one carpet bag and had stayed and the staying was its own thing, with its own shape, not a replacement for what had been but something new that existed alongside it. "What are you thinking about?" Silas said. She looked at the field. The light was nearly gone now, the sky moving toward the deep blue that preceded full dark, the first stars becoming visible at the eastern edge. "I was thinking about the woman I was in November," she said, "when I got off the stagecoach." "What about her?" "She was so tired," Eliza said. Not sadly. Just as a fact observed from a distance. Not from the journey. She'd been tired for years. From being careful. From managing everything all the time so that nothing could get at her. She paused. "It's a lot of work, being that defended. You don't notice how much work it is until you stop." Silas was quiet for a moment. "When did you stop?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm not sure I've completely stopped," she said. "I think I'm stopping. Gradually." She looked at the sleeping weight of Nellie against her. She helped. She didn't ask me to be anything. She just decided I was who she wanted, and that was that. "Children have a talent for that," Silas said. "They haven't learned yet to second-guess what they want. Adults should try it more often," she said. He looked at her from his chair. Most of its windows were dark. In the fading light, his face was quiet and readable in a way it had not been when she first arrived, or perhaps she could read it now in a way she couldn't then, because she had learned the language of him, the specific vocabulary of his stillness and his expressions, and the things he said and the things he deliberately didn't. "I know I'm not easy to be with," he said. "You're not difficult," she said. "I'm quiet," he said, "more than Silas." She looked at him. "I lived alone for 3 years. I did not come here looking for a man who would fill all the silence. I came here looking for somewhere safe. A pause. I found more than that, but the silence was never the problem." He looked at her for a moment. "Then the problem was trusting it." "Yes," she said, "that was the problem." He nodded slowly. He turned back to the field. The dark was coming now, the prairie going from color to shape to shadow, the east field a pale rectangle in the dimming light, the fence line a clean dark seam across it. "Eliza," he said, I'm glad you stayed." She looked at the field. She felt the weight of Nellie on her, the warmth of the evening, the chair solid under her, the house behind them with its lamp in the kitchen window that Nellie had lit before supper. Because she always lit it now, every evening, without being asked. "So am I," she said. And that was the truth of it, not the courthouse version or the survey document version or the version where she had arrived at exactly the right moment with exactly the right knowledge and saved the day. Those things had happened and they mattered, but they were not the whole truth. The whole truth was messier and more human and more ordinary, a woman who had been hurt enough to run, who had run far enough to end up in a stranger's kitchen in November, who had stayed not because she was brave, but because something in the staying felt more true than anything else available to her, and who had found, in the accumulated dailiness of it, the broken wood pile, and the flour sack mice, and the ragdoll's saucer at supper, and the survey documents, and the cold courthouse morning, and the cedar fence posts, and the second chair on the porch. Something she had not known she was looking for, not rescue. She had not needed rescuing. Not recognition, though that had come. Not even belonging, though she felt it now in a way that was rooted and real. What she had found was simpler and harder to name. The specific, irreplaceable experience of being the truest version of yourself in a place where the truest version of you was enough, was more than enough, was the thing that held everything else together. That was what she had found. The stars were fully out now over the Kansas prairie. Nellie was asleep and warm. The lamp burned in the kitchen behind them. Creek ran through the east field in the dark, over the limestone that had always been there, 43 feet from the boundary marker, patient and exact and permanent. Eliza Renford, Eliza Rourke, though she was still getting used to the sound of it, sat on her own porch under her own sky and felt the full, unhurried, complicated weight of a life that had stopped running and started living, and did not try to make it smaller or safer or more manageable than it was. It was large and real and hers. She let it be all three.